Hello, it's Amy, and I'm here with the next chapter of A London Book Window by James Milne. Today's chapter is called Mudie's in History. Mudie's has been the mirror of fashion in English literature for more than 3/4 of a century. It is not simply a name for a great circulating library, but a national institution. Mudie's is a tradition for the general stream of English reading in its time, and so also for English authorship, because the two live on each other. Therefore, it is not too much to say that here has been a clearinghouse for English thoughts, habits, and deeds, as these have swung into the eternal sea of print. Certainly, if you want to know the real English reader, man or woman, in particular, the reader of London society and the London middle classes, you must go and ask Mudie. He, being dead, yet speaketh. For the spirit of Charles Edward Mudie, who invented the modern circulating library, still lives in New Oxford Street, across from the British Museum. Personality was in it all, as it is in everything original or lasting, and the Mudie touch has not lost itself today, as we shall see. Do you happen yourself to be in a public line of business? If so, you will, now and then, get queer, weird letters from people. You keep those letters because they are a hallmark of confidence in you. Mudie's archives contain epistles like that, one of them saying, "Please be so good as to reply to my letter respecting the book entitled Aristotle's Works." You need a moment to discover that the request was for Aristotle's works. "Send me," another subscriber wrote, "Bath under Bone Ash," instead of Bath under Bone Ash. Particularly wanted was The Uncomical Traveller by Charles Dickens, but the applicant only got The Uncommercial Traveller. More difficult to meet was the demand, "If you haven't anything recent by Julius Caesar, give me something about him." It was the war which brought to Mudie's an order for Blackmore's Alsace-Lorraine. Most likely a prompt copy of his novel Alice Lorraine caused disappointment. It took longer to puzzle out a Darn Bee by Joliet was George Eliot's Adam Bede. Of course, Green Carnation meant that once stirful novel, the Green Carnation, and here you can't quite tell, but Green Carnation is how it's written here. Green Carnation meant that once stirful novel, the Green Carnation. Carnation is in the flower here. Paternoster Row by George Gissing was identified as implying his New Grub Street. Many well-known people have been constant readers and visitors at Mudie's. Some, what you may call habitués, Gladstone, the last English super-statesman who pilgrimaged among the old bookshops in search of a find, was frequently in the library. He was never in quest of new books, which indeed fell upon him as Harward like leaves, thanks to authors hopeful of an acknowledging postcard. What he sought was a likely bargain in some volume or edition that concerned his own subjects, says Bishop Butler or Horace. Say Bishop Butler or Horace. He was looking for books on Butler or Horace. If he knew Gardner, the historian, and Samuel Butler, the author of Irwin, he might easily have run against them at Mudie's, for they were often there. So was Richard Garnett of the British Museum, and certainly the GOM knew and esteemed him as a grand old bookman. Another frequent visitor was Cardinal Manning, a smiling pillar of aestheticism, embodying the faith and traditions of the Middle Ages transmuted into the spirit of modern progress. Oh, and Mudie's has caught the echo of many a famous foot. The iconic columns in the large saloon have looked down on many a face with a name. One picturesque figure was David Christie Murray, the novelist in his velveteen jacket, mostly the same jacket. More picturesque still was Whistler, the artist who would look in and ask whether anybody was reading his gentle art of making enemies. Not many people were when it was new, but copies of the book are now worth stealing. Darwin's Origin of Species appeared in 1859, 4 years after Mudie had moved from Southampton Row, where he began most modestly in 1844. There had been the Voyage of the Beagle in 1840, and there was to be the Descent of Man in 1871. These books, with the corresponding writings of Thomas Henry Huxley, Alfred Russel Wallace, John Tyndall, and other mastermen, stood for perhaps the greatest single leap forward in knowledge that the world has known, and they took their message to the door of Mudie's and out again. Science and Religion. Mudie's looked on at the conflict, was a good servant in it, although we, in more charted waters, can now see that there was no conflict, but merely a new assessing of values. Draper's conflict was a target in the fray, and yet how often in this present year of grace has a battered copy of it had to be handed over Mudie's counter? Hardly ever, one ventures to say. Then the song of social reform came piping down New Oxford Street in William Morris's Dream of John Bull and News from Nowhere. The note of spiritualism, meaning broadly belief in another life in another world, was sounded by F.W. Myers. It has been echoed still more definitely by Sir Oliver Lodge, Father Hugh Benson, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and a growing host of writers. The ghosts of many a cause, one lost or still in doubt, walk the corridors of Mudie's. They knew the blast that Mrs. Lyman Lytton blew out of the West for the women's movement. Dear lady, what a daring person she was supposed to be, and so dangerous. She was earlier than Sarah Grant and the Heavenly Twins, and maybe she was not as advanced. It was her friend, amiable Grant Allen, who carried the woman's red flag of revolt to the hilltop and there planted it. Again, Mudie had looked on the pageant of progressive ideas, taking his part in it, more or less, or refusing to take any part as he conceived right from the standpoint of a select library. But always he was there, always he was going out into the world with his boxes of books. Most folk think only of Mudie's in novels, which is quite wrong, and yet in a sense quite right. The great traffic had been in novels, and so will be, for the simple reason that the story is the literary thing common to everybody, old and young, educated or not. The traffic in other writings, biography and autobiography, travel and history, belles lettres and poetry, is also, however, very great. The ordeal of our long wartime made it greater, and yet the return of the average reader, the reader en masse, is ever to the novel. And why not? Everything comes within it. Nothing nowadays is left out of it, assuredly not if Mr. H.G. Wells can help it. Most men read novels for recreation, as Lord Russell Kilwin used to read a shocker after a hard day, and Mr. Lloyd George does today. Therefore, men send their office boys to Mudie's for stories with stir and go in them, and sometimes maybe for others not always in stock, which cry a different appeal. But action is the man's fodder in fiction, and blow in the blood, unless he be a literary fellow, and then he seeks often anyhow the analytical novel. Now the woman, whether she be governed alone by her sex instinct or by that set in a framing of intelligence, education, intellect, is a better novel reader than a man. She begins, though she may not know it, with a full understanding of the title of Charles Lamb's essay, The Pleasures of Anticipation. That is what every woman knows on the literary high road, and naturally it carries her over the hill and far away in the pages of fiction. She reads, if she be any real woman at all, for a stimulus of thought and feeling, which in her case may be more powerful, and therefore even when she reads rubbish, she reads seriously, throwing herself into what she reads, whereas a man does not. Watch respectfully, because also seriously, how a woman will regard a shelf of new library novels from which she means to choose one. She makes her choice quickly, as the man of Scripture was bidden to sit down and write quickly, and most likely she chooses well. Mudie's business takes the form of thousands of books circulating hither and thither, and never happily all coming home at once, because there would not be room to store them. They travel overseas in tin-lined boxes so well made that on occasion these have gone down into great waters and been fished up again without harm befalling the contents. There are also the catacombs below New Oxford Street, in which Mudie stores his retired and retiring literary battalions. It is a sad and ghostly land of forgotten names and forgotten tomes, but oh so peaceful. Nobody is there at night when the rats, inevitable underground, sally forth seeking literature to devour. Once their supper consisted of 4 novels entitled The Brilliant Peggy, The Loves of Miss Anne, Juicy Joe, and Love Among the Ruins. Why not? There were circulating libraries before Mudie's, but they were different. Morbid reservoirs, somebody described them, of dry and old-fashioned novels. You will find them and the using of them satirized in Sheridan's play The Rivals. They were contracted little affairs, working meanly and inwardly rather than outwardly in the spacious spirit, which should go with books. Here came the high idea of Charles Edward Mudie, begotten partly, perhaps, of the smallness of his father's newspaper shop down beside Chain Walk in Chelsea, where Thomas Carlyle lived later, partly perhaps from reading Milton or some other seer on the right mission of books. His idea was to scatter books, the best books, the product of the nation's best brains, by the thousands, nay, by the 100,000s, throughout London and the towns and villages of the United Kingdom. He lived to do it, and it goes on, though he had been in his grave for long. Though he has been in his grave for long. Imagination is the parent of most large ventures which succeed, because imagination means simplicity. Mudie was a simple man possessed by a simple idea, and once he had launched it, it carried him far in the ocean of books and through some strange adventures. He was not a man who professed literature, but he was a good reader with a taste for poetry, and he had an instinct for all books. It was this perhaps as much as a sound grip on the safe business road, which led him to be named dictator of the London literary world. So Carlyle said to him at one of Lady Ashburn's receptions, "You are the man who undertakes to supply the world with books, to divide the sheep from the goats. A various thing, eh? Leave it to Mudie." That came to be a saying, and he did his best to live up to it, always bearing in mind that his responsibility was a business in the form of a family library. Let a wolf in sheep's clothing creep into one of his boxes, let it go to some vicarage or quiet rural home, and where would he be? Mudie's was really by way of being a family newspaper, which had a large circulation in the print and paper of other people. Naturally, in that circumstance, he elected for the safe line, even when someone might charge him with being unheroic. He was a librarian, not a hero, but when he got books after his heart and his judgment, he could be all the hero, bold, venturesome, daring to a degree which made the old book world of London hum with excitement. "Why," sarcastically demanded an author who had felt Mudie's tyranny, didn't you refuse to circulate Bleak House because of the character of Mr. Chadband? The works of Dickens sold more widely than those of any other Victorian novelist, but much of their circulation was in part form, and Mudie did not need so many as, in different circumstances, he would have done. Of course, he was upbraided. You took thousands of Adam Bede on account of Dinah Morris, the beautiful Methodist. Poor man, he was apt to find himself wrong with some literary personage, whatever he did, but that fear neither quenched his ardor nor his endurance, as the archives of his house, if you be admitted to their intimacy, would manifest. When the 3rd and 4th volumes of Macaulay's History of England appeared in December 1855, he ordered 2,500 copies of them. Fancy the stir this order made in the town department of our oldest publishers, the Longmans of Pasternato Row. Do you know the weight of this number? You don't. Well, the 2 volumes scale about 7 pounds, so if you add a few to the 2,500 copies, you have a dead weight of 9 tons. We can't deliver that in a handcart. Mudie will have to come and fetch his tons. And Mudie did. Suppose, glancing over his archives, we record in a simple but eloquent table some of his other big deals, thus: 1857, Livingstone's Travels in South Africa, 3,500 copies. 1859, Tennyson's Idylls of the King, 1,000 copies. 1861, Essays and Reviews, an anonymous work which made as much stir in its day as Lux Mundi did in ours, 2,000 copies. 1861, George Eliot's Silas Marner, 3,000 copies. 1868, Queen Victoria's Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, 1,000 copies. 1869, McClintock's Voyage of the Fox in Search of Franklin, 3,000 copies. 1878, Lady Brassey's Voyage of the Sunbeam, 1,000 copies. 1880 Lord Beaconsfield's novel Endymion in 3 volumes, 3,000 copies. Those deals were repeated in spirit during the 90s, though Charles Edward Mudie, the pioneer, could not longer make them. For we find the library taking 3,000 copies of Stanley's Darkest Africa, a 2-volume work, and 2,500 copies of Lord Roberts' 41 Years in India, also a 2-volume book at a large price. Of the Life of Tennyson by his son, Mudie took 2,000, and it made 2 volumes. Nanson's Farthest North begat an order for 1,200, Lord Morley's Gladstone in 3 volumes, one for 1,000, and Mr. Winston Churchill's biography of his father, an order for a like number. Bear in mind always that those were advance orders, and therefore something of a gamble in what a particular book might achieve with the public. You need to be a prophet if you are to be a librarian, assuredly if you are to be Mudie's. Its record first call for a contemporary novel was probably 3,500 copies of Sir Hall Caine's Christian, now a dim spectre on a fading horizon. With it there, and in figures at Mudie's, is to be bracketed Miss Marie Corelli's Master Christian, of which 3,000 copies were needed. But later and higher comes Mrs. Humphrey Ward's romance, The Marriage of William Ashe, with a Mudie record of 3,216 copies. Be it noted that Mrs. Ward was always a best circulator. May this counterpart of bestseller be invented? At Mudie's, those sound, solid English tastes, interesting but safe, she well represented. It was all different in the era of the comfortable 3-volume novel, which Mudie helped to end, just because it had exhausted its mission. Well, once it was, or was thought to be, a pillar of the circulating library, it came to be a costly burden. So in 1894, something happened, and it died as a result of a scrap of paper signed first by Mr. Arthur O. Mudie, the chief of the house in succession to his father, and then by the other circulating libraries of London. There had been the Green Carnation, for whose authorship a well-remembered name had been mentioned. On top of it came the Yellow Aster of Mrs. Mannington Caffin, and it boomed in the most magnificent way. Mudie's kicked on business grounds about being left with enormous cargoes of 3-deckers, and out of that rumpus was born the 6-shilling novel, which the war sent up to a higher figure. But the same brave old flag, a true ensign to English reading, still flies over Mudie's, though you will see it on red-letter days only. And so that is the end of that chapter on Mudie's in English history. Mudie's in history. And we are coming swiftly to the close of A London Book Window by Milne. We have just one chapter left, and it is titled All the King's English.